Hello everyone, this is Space Café podcast and I am Marcus. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time. I mean, when else do you have the time to talk to the Pope's personal astronomer? I wasn't sure at first how it would turn out. I mean, like, religion and science have a certain history, and how does that fit into our new space-dominated world? Now, after this conversation, I can say we need more of it, much more of it. More dialogue with the less obvious. And that's where I think we are well on our way with the Space Café podcast when it comes to delivering to you what others don't. Now, if you have time, find your favorite place or something similar where you can really enjoy the upcoming conversation with Brother Guy Consolmagno, the Pope's very own astronomer.
Go right in and then feel free to edit whatever I say to make me sound intelligent.
I would like to start in 1989 when you decided to enter the Society of the Jesuits. That must have been a special moment.
It was a series of moments. It was a long and strange tale. I have to go back to the fall of 1970. And I had just started university. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I had gone to a Jesuit university because I went to a Jesuit high school and I liked the Jesuits, and I had in the back of my mind that I might want to be a Jesuit, but I might want to be a journalist, but I might want to be a lawyer. And I was madly in love with the girl I'd taken to the senior prom in high school, and she had no time for me. So, all of these different things were going on in my head. And I was at Boston College, this Jesuit school, and living in the freshman dorms, and all the freshmen were mostly interested in partying. And I'm a nerd. I love to study. I wanted to learn everything. So two things struck me. One, that I was very unhappy where I was because I was not a party goer. And I had to do something.
So what were you doing when the others were at the parties? What were you doing?
I would keep the door closed to make sure they didn't get into my room and, throw up over all of my clothes and things. Because they were pretty messy, smelly. To this day, I cannot stand the smell of beer because it reminds me of those days. So, I would be in my room. I had a stereo that had a wonderful turntable and a wonderful amplifier and no speakers because I just had headphones. Because who else needs to listen to my music? I'm the only one who's interested in my music. I was, very antisocial.
What kind of music was that?
I had it was a mixture of classic rock, Cream, and also classical. You could get Bamberg Symphony Orchestra records, wonderful classical albums that were very cheap. And I was a student, so I wanted it cheap. Well, I was listening to music and wondering what to do with my life and thought, well, this is the wrong place to be, so I should be a Jesuit priest. And so I went and found a Jesuit I knew and said, where do I sign up? And he said, have you prayed about this? And I'm thinking, who prays? Come on, I'm 18 years old. I figured, okay, Jesuits are supposed to do that. So he goes, go to your room and ask God, is this what you want? I'll go to my room.
Wow. How was your relationship with God back in the day?
It was pretty good because I've always been very close to my father. And I think if you've got a good relationship with your dad, you can have a good relationship with God. That the two, you can picture the one. If you've got a terrible relationship with your father, then you have a hard time understanding what God is, except just a bigger, nastier father. So I was blessed in having a wonderful father. Lived to be 100. So, very blessed.
Good genes.
Absolutely. Well, when I'm sitting there wondering, is there a voice going to come from the ceiling? I was asking myself, what am I expecting? What is this prayer thing all about? Because I was not hearing a voice from the ceiling. But a question popped in the back of my head. First of all, what kind of job is being a priest? Well, I guess you like work with people, like people with problems, like people who drink too much and make noises in the hallway, and just like the people I'm trying to get away from. Because I'm really terrible with people. I just listen to my stereo and headphones. And then the second question is, where are you happy? And I'm really not happy where I was. I was happy when I was visiting my high school friend who was at MIT, which was just up the road from Boston College. They're both in Boston, Cambridge. And they had weekend movies and they had tunnels you could explore and exciting things were happening. But most of all, they had the world's largest collection of science fiction.
Wow. So MIT's not so much a party place as opposed to other colleges?
Different kind of partying, let's say. MIT students find their own sort of fun. And it happened to be my kind of fun. So first of all, I realized either I had not heard any prayers because there was no God, in which case it would be stupid to be a priest, or what I had just heard was God telling me it would be stupid to be a priest. But either way, the answer was clear. And on a whim, next time I was visiting my friend at MIT, I walked into the admissions office and said, what do I have to do to transfer? And they said, well, fill out these forms and have an interview. So I filled out the forms. I didn't have the background of someone doing science. I had done classics. I had done Latin and ancient Greek. And I took calculus in high school. That was the only thing that really got me one leg up. But they said, why do you want to come to MIT? And I knew to read science fiction wasn't the answer. So I said, I'm going to be a science journalist. That was the flavor of the day that day. They said, you've got to come here. We've got to admit you. And they did. So a year later, there I am wondering, what am I doing here at MIT? And they said, well, you've got to declare, what are you going to study? I'm not going to study engineering because I'm hopeless at building things. And I'm not going to study physics because, come on, I'm a history major, But they had a major called Earth and Planetary Science. And I saw planets. Planets were places where people have adventures, like my science fiction books. So I checked that off, only to discover that it was actually Earth and Planetary Science. It was really the geology department.
You should have read the entire title.
Exactly. But what could be more boring than looking at rocks? So I had no idea. What am I doing here? I'm reading science fiction. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to pretend I'm interested in rocks. Yeah, right. And then I discovered that there are rocks that fall out of the sky from the asteroid belt called meteorites. You can hold a piece of outer space in your hand and touch it and smell it. And it is a piece of space. And this excited me so much that I fell in love with rocks, at least rocks from outer space. And I tried doing science journalism in the summertime, and I was really terrible at it. But as part of being a student at MIT, you also do research, and I was actually pretty good at that. So all of a sudden, I discovered this is where I was supposed to be. I went and got a doctorate in Arizona. Interesting thing, when I was at the University of Arizona in the mid to late 70s, one of the faculty members was this Jesuit priest named George Coyne. And I thought, I could have done this and be a priest, except that God made it clear to me, I'm not going to be a priest. I'm not meant to be a priest. Don't be a priest. So my life goes on. I get a career. I, make friends. I publish important papers. I make enemies. I publish papers that people are mad at me about. The typical scientific career. And then I hit 30 years old. And that was 1982. And oh my gosh, I'm not a young man anymore. My life is passing me by. I'm writing these papers, but I can't get a faculty job. And meanwhile, there are people starving in the world. Because, those same religious impulses that made me think being a Jesuit would have been a good idea hadn't gone away. And I'm thinking, why am I doing astronomy when people starve in the world? So, at this point, I said, I'm going to do something radical. I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to quit being a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. I'm going to say goodbye to science because science is useless and pointless, and who needs astronomy anyway? And I'm going to join the U.S. Peace Corps and go, wherever they send me, do whatever they want me to do. Well, they send me to Kenya. They send me to Africa. And within a month of being in Africa, they say, we're going to put you not in a rural school someplace in the middle of nowhere, which is what I was looking for to help people who needed help. We're going to put you at the best high school in the country, where they've got, computer labs and lasers. This is 1982. My high school back in Detroit didn't have computer labs and lasers.
Wow.
But this high school did.
Wow.
Best high school in the country. Mm-hmm. And I taught there one term, and they said, no, you're going to go to the university and teach astrophysics to graduate students. I thought, I could have done this in Boston. But the difference was every weekend, I had all of these other Peace Corps volunteers who I'd enter the country with. We trained together. We were all friends. I'd go up to their country, to their schools, where, things were wonderfully remote, and there was, windows in the windows and no black in the blackboards and real Peace Corps. And I thought, okay, I'll give talks to their school. I'll talk about, I had a handful of slides. And so, the old slide projectors that, with projecting on the wall, and talk about space missions. And all the kids were fascinated. And I had a little telescope because, I still liked astronomy. And so I brought my little telescope out, and everybody in the village would want to look through the telescope, and they wanted to see the craters in the moon. And they wanted to see,
Wow.
The rings of Saturn. Have you ever seen the rings of Saturn through a little telescope? Have you ever seen the rings of Saturn and not gone, oh, wow? Absolutely. I've been looking at the rings of Saturn for 60 years, and I still go, oh, wow. And everybody in Africa goes, oh, wow, because human beings go, oh, wow, when you see the rings of Saturn, because that's one of the things that makes us more than just well-fed cows. And that's why you do astronomy, even when people are starving in the world. And suddenly it all made sense. And I came back to that same sense of wonder that I used to be able to get out of science fiction. And it was there in astronomy. I got back to America because I'd been in Africa. That made me stand out from the 100 other people applying for a job. I got a job at a little college in Pennsylvania teaching, and I loved it. And I thought, this is great, but there's one last piece missing. Something in a different dimension in my life, whether it's, a wife and a family or, being a priest. But of course, I know God doesn't want me to be a priest.
Was wife and family still something of interest back in the day for you?
Oh, absolutely. And I was dating, one woman after another, thinking this is going to be the one. And of course, I only dated smart women, and they were smart enough to know that, no, this wasn't the one. So, two of my Peace Corps friends were getting married, and I was at the wedding, and I was really happy for them. And I suddenly realized, yeah, but maybe that's not what I want. The last time I was at this point, I sort of went to the room, closed the door, and asked God, I wonder if that would work again. I mean, I know he doesn't want me to be a priest, but so, in a quiet moment after the wedding, I'm asking God, what do you want me to do? And I suddenly remembered something that I had forgotten for 25 years. When I was at the Jesuit high school, I had met a young Jesuit with a PhD in history. So you can get advanced degrees, but he was a brother, not a priest. Mm-hmm. You can be a Jesuit. You could teach at a Jesuit school. I love teaching at schools. You could do this academic, intellectual work without having to be a priest. You could be a brother. Mm-hmm. I thought, that's crazy.
Can I just ask a quick question? How did you know back then when you asked God that this was God's voice and not your own voice? Because, we all have our voices in our heads. So how could you differentiate between the two?
It turns out that that's one of the key bits of Jesuit spirituality, learning how to do that. I didn't know that at the time. The best you can do in the short term is you ask your friends, am I crazy? Am I just talking to myself? There's a wonderful line in a movie called The Ruling Class where Peter O'Toole, who's crazy, says, I'm God because whenever I pray to God, I'm talking to myself. Therefore, I must be God. And that is a fallacy you can fall into. That's why the Jesuits have this whole set of routines of things you do to check, is this for real or am I crazy? That's why you do it on your own. That's why you don't do science in your basement, and write these missives with all capital letters that you wind up emailing to the head of the Vatican Observatory. God help me, I get way too many of them. So what I did was I spent a year asking my friends, including old girlfriends. And they're all saying, yeah, we could have told you that, which is not what you want to hear from an old girlfriend, except they were intelligent. They were smart women. They knew. And the longer I lived with the idea, the more sense it made. But even then, once you enter the Jesuits, there's still a 2-year testing period before you take vows, where you then learn these exercises, and they're actually called spiritual exercises. And you learn how to discern, is it the real thing, or is it just something masquerading like the real thing?
Is this a road where they are testing you, or is it a road where you're also testing yourself? Is it something like per aspera ad astra, like you have to go through the hard times to find out if this is something for you?
It's actually just the opposite. In this case, they were much like the Peace Corps. They make it very easy to quit. If you don't belong there, they don't want you. Mm-hmm. And so they give you every moment to determine, am I really in the right place? Let me tell you an astronomy story about the Peace Corps. Another thing that opened my eyes to why space and astronomy is a good thing. I'm a nerd, right? I'm the kind of guy who listens to music by myself. Suddenly, I'm on the other side of the world, in a foreign country, in a foreign climate, foreign food, foreign language, wondering, what am I doing here? Feeling immensely homesick. And at that point, the Peace Corps was saying, if you want to go home, we'll put you on a plane tomorrow morning, no questions asked. And I finally determined this was crazy. I came here on a stupid whim, and I don't belong in Africa, and I have to go home. But if I'm going to go home tomorrow, tonight's my last chance to see the Southern Cross. I had my favorite book of constellations. I look up, and yes, in December at the equator, you can see the Southern Cross at about 4 a.m. So I get up at 4 a.m, and I look, and there's the Southern Cross. And it's really sweet. I don't know if you've ever seen the Southern Cross. Mm-mm. It's like a little kite, a little 4 stars in a kite shape. And it's just really sweet looking. And my life is complete. I've now seen the Southern Cross. I've seen Alpha and Beta Centauri. I can go home. And when I turn around to go back to where I was staying, in the northern sky is Ursa Major, the Big Dipper. And at that moment, all the winter constellations are setting because it's early in the morning. So there's Orion. And all the summer constellations, Vega and Altair and Deneb rising. And right overhead is Leo the Lion. And these are all the constellations I had grown up with when I was a child. And I said to myself, why am I homesick? Any place where I can see the stars that I grew up with, I am at home.
It's right here.
It's right here. Astronomy gives you a sense of home. Astronomy pulls you out of yourself and those questions of, what am I having for lunch? To realize you're more than just an animal looking for lunch. You're a human being. You don't live by bread alone.
Fascinating. You have astronomy talking to you. It's not God. That was a moment where science is talking to you.
And it's the same voice.
Interesting.
For me,
could you elaborate on that? What do you mean?
For me, doing science is an act of worship. For me, hunting for the truth and not being satisfied with anything less than the truth, even when the truth turns out to mean that my favorite theory is wrong. Which has happened more than once.
So now the heavenly signs were aligned, so to say, and what happened after that?
Well, as I stayed in the Peace Corps, I was working as a professor. I entered the Jesuits, and the longer I was there, the more I realized this is where I fit. I had been a happy person before, but now I was a content person. And the closest analogy I can give is when I talk to friends of mine who have got a great marriage. And I say, of all the people you dated, how did you know this was the one? Mm-hmm. And they stumble for the words, but it's clear that it was different. This was the one different from all the others. And, of all the jobs I had and all the places I'd lived and all the bits of work I had done, being a Jesuit, this was the one that made me content that, yes, I am now where I belong. And I was, nearly 40 years old when that happened. It took a long time.
Now you're in the society as a scientist. So you're entering the society as a scientist. And I mean, this could be a tricky thing, especially when it comes to the Catholic Church and science. I mean, we know the history and our historical records. So I would be interested in
you say you know the history. You say you know the history. What's the history you think you know?
I think the history I know is called Giordano Bruno, and the history I think is called Galileo Galilei. I mean, that's
yep.
That's just
those are the two examples everybody gives because nobody can come up with any other examples. So number one, look up Giordano Bruno in Wikipedia. Don't take my word for it. Look it up in Wikipedia. He was a nasty piece of work. He managed to make enemies of everybody. He was kicked out of every country in Europe. And even after he was arrested, he wound up in Milan and finally, things were so bad there that they arrested him. It was 10 years of him refusing to cooperate or even, apologize before he was burned at the stake. People should not be burned. But given the mores of the time, it was not unusual. It happened in every country and every place that people who were considered, a threat to society. This was a time of terrible wars. People were killing each other over religion. So
Right.
Going around trying to, start your own religion was a great way of getting people killed. I'm not justifying what happened to him, but what happened to him had nothing to do with his science. The things that he said, that every star is the sun, had been said by a cardinal 200 years earlier. Nicholas of Cusa was saying that.
So when you entered the society, where was the Catholic Church and science? I mean, where did they stand?
They've never had issues as far as science is concerned. Galileo had issues. But that had more to do with Galileo's personality and the times when he lived. Because who did he have issues with? Other scientists who happened to be priests. Mm-hmm. I'm here sitting in just in radio, you can't see it, but I'm in a library right now filled with books that are the scientific journals of the 17th and 18th and 19th century sitting on shelves behind me. You can pick up any one of those volumes from the 1700s and ask yourself, who is writing scientific papers in 1735? And the answer is noblemen, medical doctors, and clergymen. Because who else had the education and the free time to do science? What is scientific work at the end of the day? The boring stuff I do when I'm in front of my computer day in and day out dealing with data. It's sorting data. It's filing data. It's, nowadays I use Excel spreadsheets. When I was young, you would write it on little, 3x5 cards and sort and file the cards. It's clerical work. Why is it called clerical? Because it was done by clerics. Sorting and filing data is what a parish priest does. Let me tell you the names of 3 scientists who I'm sure you've heard of. Volta. We named volts for him, devout Catholic. Ampere. We had named amps for him, devout Catholic who was very active in the church in France in the 19th century. James Clerk Maxwell, not Catholic. He was a Protestant, but he was, an Anglican. Devout man, whose papers we have in the shelf behind me about, the electromagnetic wave. You've heard of the Big Bang? You've probably heard of Georges Lemaitre, a Catholic priest who came up with the theory. Let me even go deeper than that. if you're going to be a scientist, if you're really going to do science in the Western typical way, there are 3 axioms you have to take on faith before science is even possible. You have to believe that the universe is real. Well, what else am I studying? Maybe it's all illusion. Maybe a heck of what I think is real is illusion, but there is a reality underneath, or else what am I studying?
Or a simulation.
It's a religious belief. You have to believe that the universe follows laws. We're used to that now because we found the laws and we've applied the laws. And, we can make bridges that stay up and airplanes that fly. The laws work. But who was the first person who thought there were laws? Trust me, it was not the guy who thought that everything happened because some nature god threw a lightning bolt. Some god of crops caused, or goddess of crops caused the crops to grow. It was only the people of the book, the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, who rejected the nature gods and said, we believe in a God who is not in nature, but supernatural. But there's a third thing you have to believe, and this is the most subtle, but the most important, and something that I had lost when I was wondering, why am I doing astronomy? You have to believe that the knowledge itself is good in and of itself, and that the universe is good in and of itself. That if you think that the only thing worth doing is to meditate and to leave the world behind, to reject the world, you're not going to be a scientist.
Why is the universe good? I mean, why attribute a positive connotation to the universe? So why is it not just in itself neutral?
If you thought the universe was neutral, would you spend the time looking at the stars at night? But where do I get that faith that it's good? It's right out of the book of Genesis. Every step of creation, God says, this is good. Even though the world that we experience is full of crime and pain and death and, things, COVID viruses, things that are not good, we have this belief that under it all is a goodness that ought to be there and that is missing.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be motivated to come up with vaccines to get rid of the virus.
Because goodness is giving hope.
Goodness is giving hope. Goodness is what's expressed in beauty. And, you've probably seen 1,000 images from the Hubble Space Telescope. They never show you ugly ones, do they? There aren't any.
Same holds true for mathematics. If you look at geometry, chaos theory, that's all beauty. It is,
and you know that you're approaching the right answer, whether it's a mathematical theorem or a scientific theory. Not that the right answer is the final answer, because in science you always have more to learn. But you're getting closer because there is this little jolt of joy that makes you bounce up and down and say, oh, this is it, this is it.
So if you're coming up with a solution to a tricky problem, and that solution is highly complex and complicated and looks strange and has no appeal, the chances are that you're on the wrong track.
And you're going to say to yourself, there's got to be an easier way. Okay. One of the great things I discovered teaching when I was in Kenya, teaching the graduate students at the University of Nairobi, these were some brilliant kids, because the filter to get into the university, of the several million people who are college age, only a few thousand get to the university. How do you do that? Well, you wind up with really bright kids. They're phenomenally hardworking. And one of the hardest things to teach them by the time they got to graduate school was hard work is a sign that you haven't thought through the problem carefully enough.
So you are not yet a brother, right? When we walk through your history.
Right.
But almost. So you're going through your 2 years?
I did through my 2 years. I took vows. The other fellows who were taking vows that, yes, we'll be Jesuits, were planning to go on to become priests and to study to be priest. But I was only going to learn enough philosophy to give me a sort of grounding of what was going on. I didn't have to do the same set courses that you have to do if you're going to be ordained. And that gave me freedom to, take fun courses, a wonderful philosophy of science course, a whole set of ethics classes, because science runs into ethical problems. I don't want to be an ethicist, but I want to understand where they're coming from. And so that was fascinating. It was great. At the same time I was in Chicago, I was allowed to take advanced classes in physics at the University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So the same semester that I was taking a really advanced graduate level course in quantum physics, I was also taking a philosophy course of Heidegger's philosophy. Mm-hmm. And you suddenly realize where Bohr and his philosophical understanding of, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics is really Heidegger's philosophy. They're, in the same place at the same time. What a surprise. Mm-hmm. It suddenly, clarified where these ideas were coming from. And after that, I was ready to go. I'd been a professor at a little university. I loved that. I was ready to go to a little Jesuit university because that was where I was aiming, to teach astronomy and to teach physics at a place like Boston College, at a place like Georgetown, at a place like Loyola in Chicago. Or if you follow American basketball, all the teams that are really good basketball schools, many of them happen to be Jesuit schools because they're in center cities. Mm-hmm. Okay, I was ready to teach there. But you see, when you take vows, what are the vows? Poverty. I don't own anything. Whatever I have is given to me by the society. Whatever I need is given to me by the society. But, I don't own a sailboat. I don't own a really nice stereo. I don't own fancy clothes, most of which I wouldn't want anyway. I'd been a grad student.
Do you own a telescope?
I have the little telescope that I took to Africa. I brought with me. It's in my room, but technically it belongs to, whoever would most need it. And when I die, it will be handed over to some other, young Jesuit who wants a telescope. That's the way it works. Chastity, which in this case means I'm not going to have a girlfriend. I'm not going to have a wife and family. Well, that wasn't happening anyway, so I was pretty used to that.
How difficult is that?
After a while, you realize, especially if you've had bad experiences, then you realize, it's nothing is more wonderful than a romantic relationship when it works, and nothing is worse than one that doesn't work. Which is not to say that you're running away from it because it's bad, but to say that it's not the solution to all your problems. One of the bizarre discoveries I made is that once I took a vow saying I'm not going to marry anyone, I suddenly have the freedom to have a number of women who are friends, who can be friends because, well, not just that I'm safe, though that's part of it. They know I'm not going to be making a move. I know I'm not going to be making a move. I'm not interested in that. I can be interested in them as wonderful people. And I've always enjoyed
an additional quality of life.
Women. Yeah. And it gives me the freedom to live the other side of my life, to do all the travel I do, to do the work I do, because I couldn't do that and be fair to any family I was trying to be, a father to. Mm-hmm. That third vow that you take, though, is obedience. And they didn't tell you that's the hard one. You don't say, I'm going to choose that job. They say, okay, this is where we think you belong. You can report to them, here's where I find my greatest joys. This is what I think is marvelous. This is, you can try to talk them into, but at the end of the day, they say jump and you jump. I wanted to teach. They looked at my background and said, no, you're not going to teach. We're going to send you to the Vatican Observatory. You're going to do full-time research. I had done full-time research. That had burned me out so much I wound up going to Africa to run away from it. Why do I want to do that? Not only that, but I have to live in this foreign country. I have to live in Italy with all of its terrible scenery and miserable food. And, the sunsets are just so, And, did I mention, when I arrived at the Vatican Observatory, I discovered a beautiful collection of meteorites. More than 1,000 meteorites. Did I mention meteorites? Meteorites are what got me into this business in the first place. But under insane. Obedience, this is where I had to be.
Were you a brother already then?
So I became a brother when I took vows 2 years after. And that's basically the final stage. there was a point where I finally take final vows. The first vows are, okay, I agree to follow the rules, but the Jesuits have the right to kick me out at a moment's notice if they want to.
Mm-hmm.
The final vows are, okay, we realize you're in it for the long run, and we'll take care of you, through sickness and health, for better or worse.
So how does that feel? I mean, like, I'm married, so there's a certain connotation and feeling towards that vow and towards being married. So I do have memories, of course, how I felt back in that moment. So how was that for you?
It was, more than anything else, a sense of being home. I had finally found home. And one of the most distressing things, I don't know how old you were when you were married, but when you're in your late 20s, early 30s, and you don't fit into anybody's boxes, I'm single, I'm not married, I'm not a priest, I'm not gay. What's the problem with this guy, And the problem wasn't that there was a problem. But when you're 30 and stupid, you think these things. You think, well, there must be something wrong with me. Well, no. There isn't anything wrong with you. It's who you are. And once I entered religious life, I didn't do it in order to fall into a box. But it made the rest of the world understand, okay, this is who he is. We get it. We can deal with that.
Great. So let's talk about the Vatican Observatory. So why does the Vatican have an observatory in the first place?
If God made the universe, which we believe, God expresses himself in the things that are made. And that means that studying how things are made is a way of getting closer to God. And that's one of the reasons why the early medieval universities would have astronomy, what we would call cosmology, as one of the major courses you had to take, along with music and mathematics. Because understanding the universe is understanding God. That's why the church cared about what Galileo said, and why the church cared about cosmology, because it meant, if Aristotle is wrong, then we're going to have to readjust our theology. When Aristotle was wrong, and they did have to readjust their theology. But it's not the kind of thing you want to give up right away, any more than most people would give up general relativity now. There are alternative relativities, but general relativity works really well. You're going to have to really convince me that there's something wrong before I give it up. That's kind of what the case was with Galileo.
What do you see when you look at the sky? Because, as a child, I was told that God is up there in heaven. And now, you being an astronomer, do you know where God lives? What do you see when you look up into the sky?
Yeah, I certainly don't see a place where God lives. No, not at all. And that is such a common way of looking at it that, so many words in our common languages. Cielo in Italian means both heaven and sky. In English, at least, we have two different words, heaven and sky, though people will talk about the heavens as a way of describing the sky. But that's when they've had too much classical education. And it's funny, when I look at the sky, I see familiar stars that are familiar to me not only because I learned the constellations as a child, but then I learned the science as well. So if I look at Arcturus, I can see, that's the star that I follow by looking at the curve of the handle of the Big Dipper. And I remember being taught that by my dad, you arc to Arcturus. But that's the star that's got this orangish color because it's a red giant. And now I also add to it all of the science that I've learned. And it just gives an extra dimension, an extra depth. So that, in addition, another crazy thing, when I was in Africa in the Peace Corps, I had this little telescope. I had these dark skies, and I realized I didn't know where to point the thing. There were so many stars. So when I came home, I found an amateur astronomer friend of mine. We wrote a book. Where do you point your little telescope? The book's called Turn Left at Orion. And that means that now I've got a pretty good knowledge of which of those stars in the sky are fun to look at a little telescope, and a memory of, oh yeah, I remember when I was at the star party, the Okie-Tex star party in 2009, and it was really dark, and I pointed the telescope there, and I saw this amazing. So there was this whole history when I look at the sky. It's
but
the
what does
pretty dots overhead and everything else.
What does the Jesuit brother see when he looks up?
The joy that comes from looking, the beauty that comes from looking, the amazement that this little guy with a 3-pound brain can in some way still capture the universe. And me being a part of the universe can be the universe being aware of itself. And the miracle that all of this is possible.
They call you the Pope's astronomer. Do you see the Pope often?
Not often. On occasion, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. I've never had an occasion to have a sit-down one-on-one chat with him. I could if I needed to. The need hasn't come up. But we have special groups, we had a meeting on cosmology a few years ago with a couple of Nobel Prize winners and some of the Jesuits here at the observatory who are experts in cosmology and quantum gravity and that sort of thing. Well, we had that group come and visit the Pope, and the Pope gave them an audience. Greeted them, said some nice things, that sort of thing.
So the Pope does obviously show interest in astronomy.
I've worked for 3 popes, and they've all been interested in what we do. They've all been academics. John Paul II and Benedict were both professors. When we moved from the papal palace, the summer palace we used to be in, into new quarters, which, oh my gosh, are so much nicer than a 500-year-old building that needed paint. Pope Benedict came and opened it for us. And then we had a chance to chat. I was describing the meteorites to him. We were cracking jokes. Benedict, one-on-one, is just an incredibly charming guy and very intelligent. So he was full of all sorts of really good questions.
So do you have any knowledge about the Catholic Church's reaction to the moon landing? Was this some sort of desecration of God's abode that humans suddenly appear up there?
You can find the speech that Pope Paul VI gave from our telescope here in Castel Gandolfo on the night of June 20th, 1969, where he greets the astronauts, he thanks them for their work, and he expresses the amazement that we all had that now people are walking there. Several popes have spoken to astronauts while in space, but I think this was the first one. And just utter delight, as the whole world was. Because all of this universe is God's creation. It doesn't stop with the blue sky. And that is one of the things I love about being a Catholic. It has this universal view of the world. It has this sense that creation goes on to 13.7 billion years ago, but is also happening right now. Creation is not something that just happened once at the Big Bang. Creation is the continual existence of the laws of physics that made the Big Bang possible.
So, does God have a place, a specific location? Are there coordinates where you would think you might find God?
What do we know about God and creation? We can go back to Scripture. Genesis chapter 1. The science in Genesis chapter 1 is 2,500 years old. It was the best science of its day during the time of Babylonians, but, the science has improved a bit since then. But the book isn't about science. It's about God. In the beginning, God's already there. God is there before there's a universe. Before there is space and time, there is God. And that means that God is transcendent. Outside is the best word we can come up with, though there's really, what do you mean outside? It's because I can't get a better word. But it means equally present in all space and all time. And that's what immanent means. So the philosophers talk about God being transcendent and immanent, outside of the universe, and yet equally present at every place and every time. There are places where we human beings need to say, okay, I'm going to go to this room as a place where I will, confront God, because I'm not infinite in space and time. I need a place to say, this is where I'm going to pray. It's useful for me. And God says, you want to do that? Okay, I'll meet you there. But God is everywhere.
So do we need, you're very close to the Sistine Chapel. Mm-hmm. You're very close to the ceiling, to the famous paintings of Michelangelo. And you're very close to seeing depictions of God and anthropomorphized depictions, of course, that is. So does God, to you, have a shape? Or do we need to repaint that ceiling with our new knowledge and new philosophy and new science?
When I'm in the lab, I'm also dealing with an anthropomorphized version of the universe, a mathematics that was invented by human beings to give shape so that I can understand what's going on in the universe. Would the mathematics of, some multi-tentacled creatures in Alpha Centauri look like ours? It might be close enough that we could recognize what they were doing, but it might be different enough that we have no idea. As I say, we've got a guy here who does the quantum gravity, and I half the time have no idea what he's talking about. And he's not an alien. He's from Naples. But in the same way, the way that I understand God, it's like my father. It's an analogy. Just as Newton's law of gravity is a piece of poetry, the path of a falling object is like the solution of this equation. I know that my picture of God is anthropocentric and is limited with all the limitations that I have. And I know the longer I live, the more I understand what God is all about. Not that I'm discovering new pieces, but that I'm saying the pieces that I thought I knew are so much richer than I ever realized. But that's what happens to me in the lab as well.
Let's make a hard cut. What are your thoughts on SpaceX, Blue Origin, New Space, Artemis, Mars plans? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm delighted, excited, and worried.
Why worried?
Well, I don't like thousands of little satellites cluttering up my sky. And
we're talking about space debris.
We're not only talking about space debris, we're talking about the constellations of satellites that each of these companies is putting up to make the money, which I don't think is going to work. I think it's in the long run going to be. But these are all companies by human beings, and every human being, including myself, is prone to doing stupid things. We need rules and governments and ways of enforcing the rules to try to limit the stupid mistakes we're likely to make with each other. And we don't yet have that in space. The closest we have is the United Nations, the UNOOSA, which is in Vienna, the United Nations.
Yes, it's around the corner.
It's, Office of Outer Space.
Yeah.
And here at the Vatican Observatory, we try to be a neutral ground where the scientists and the space industrialists and the diplomats can all talk to each other. We had a workshop here a few years ago on exactly that topic. I love the idea of going into space. I think that we as human beings will be richer, and I don't just mean monetarily, for having more than one place to look at. I'm old enough to remember when Bill Anders took that picture of the Earth rising above the moon and how that changed the way that people saw planet Earth and how it was overnight a change. The human race was richer for that image. The human race will be richer for people who will be living on the moon. The human race will be poorer if we go to Mars and pollute the place before we can find whether or not there's Martian life there. Not all progress is necessarily good, But we have to be human and recognize that we're going to make mistakes, and we have to give ourselves room to try to correct the mistakes and try to avoid the worst of them, but not beat ourselves up because we're going to make mistakes or hide in our rooms to hope that we don't make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. But it seems like, at least to me, it seems like we're getting restless on Earth, and it seems as we're ready to venture off this planet for good. At least this is the impression I have. We're building up pressure on this planet, and perhaps we need to take the lid off.
Yep. And what's going to happen with all of these companies is they will get in each other's way, and people will come along and figure out a way of stealing what they've spent so much money to get, whether it's data or minerals or whatever. And eventually, the Wild West is going to have a marshal come in and figure out a way of policing it, because that's the way human beings, it's the way civilization has worked up to now, until somebody comes up with a better way of doing it. Sadly, I also know enough about how human beings work is that there's probably going to be some disaster that finally wakes people up to the need for this. I just hope the disaster is a few satellites running into each other rather than people getting killed. But that's, as I say, I got into this because of science fiction. Space opera is, I've been living in this world. Most of the world that's seen the Star Wars movies has been living in a world that expects to see this. And I would be shocked and saddened if it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Is it a good thing that we're trying to look for new places and we're going for good to leave the place, to leave Earth, to venture into new territory?
Well, I'll give you the example.
Is that our destiny?
I'll give you the example of what happens when you leave America, a very shy, nerdly person, and go off to Africa for 2 years. You grow enormously, and then you go home. And the Peace Corps will tell you, you don't believe them, but they will tell you from their experience, the hardest part of the Peace Corps 2 years in Africa is going home. Because you see home in a completely new way. You see things that you never noticed before. Things that you thought, it's those Africans are doing that. Wait a minute, we're doing that too. Gee, maybe we're both human beings. Maybe we're both, prone to the same good things and the same mistakes. This is what's called growing. We need it.
What can we do to not fall into the same pattern as we have experienced it a couple of 100 years ago when colonization, the conquistadors, found new lands and made many mistakes. So, we're in the same situation right now. It's just a new continent, and that new continent is up there. So
there are some
how can we make sure
There are some differences. On the one hand, so far as we know, there aren't other intelligent beings whose land we're going to be stealing. On the other hand, it's dangerous out there, everywhere. And if you don't cooperate, you die very quickly.
Space doesn't like us, it seems.
Well, it doesn't like us being sloppy. But then that was true of, people living in caves for the million years before we developed how to grow crops and brew beer. It means that there will be different pressures, and it means we'll make different mistakes. We're going to make mistakes. And I think part of being a person of religion, a good religion at least, is one that recognizes that we are all people prone to make mistakes. We are all people who need to forgive each other and ourselves and try to make things better and pick ourselves up and try to do better the next time.
What if Elon Musk called you up right now on your smartphone and asked you if you were ready to be part of the next Mars mission or wherever he wants to go? What would you say?
I'd be torn. I'm not sure I trust him. But
he has delivered. He has delivered so far.
Yeah, well, so has NASA. He is also He's one person, and I don't trust one person. I trust a bureaucracy. For all that bureaucracies get in your way, they also have a certain minimal standard of listening to more than just one person. I would trust NASA if NASA wanted to send me someplace. Even though NASA has certainly screwed up and made mistakes. I would trust ESA, even though ESA has screwed up and made mistakes. That said, if anybody offered me a chance to go into space, I'd be a fool to say no.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I think that in space, your presence would be a great benefit to whoever you're traveling with.
I have to remind you that I am still the nerd who likes to listen to music by myself. I'm still fairly antisocial. I had an experience as close as I'll ever get to being on another planet about 25 years ago when I was part of an expedition, 6 people, living in 3 tents on the East Antarctic ice plateau, collecting meteorites in Antarctica.
Wow.
And
how was that?
It was a profound experience. It was a difficult experience. It was wonderfully memorable. And yet, at the end of the day, I was real happy to come home, too. There are people who I think were really well adapted to being in space and being astronauts, whose personalities really fit that. And I'm probably not one of them.
We all know, I mean, like you're a science fiction buff. We all know those guys on spaceships when they travel for eons through space. They're the ones, those guys sitting in their quarters, never saying anything. They are the tricky ones, right?
Oh, yeah. But you don't want to be one of the guys wearing the red shirt because they die in Act 1. But you also don't want to be one of the guys who goes mildly crazy when you least expect it.
One last question. Who is, in your opinion, the leading space nation in the future?
In the future depends how far in the future. But I'll give you one.
10 years.
10 years, nothing's going to change in 10 years. But at the moment, there are missions to the moon that have happened or will happen from the United States, from Russia, from China, from Japan, from India, from Korea, from Israel. There are 20 different nations and entities that have the capability to put things in space, not even counting the private companies that are going to do it. There is no one place that's going to dominate. But if I was looking to the long term, 50 or 100 years, geographically, what do you want for a country that's going to launch things? You want to be close to the equator? You want to have a stable economy and a well-developed economy and a well-educated populace. And you want to have the ocean to the east of you because you love to launch things to the east in case they fail and wind up in the ocean. Look at a globe and you'll find the countries that I think in 50 years will qualify are Indonesia and Kenya. And I'm hoping that maybe some of the kids I taught in Kenya will be involved, or their students will be involved in making Kenya a marvelous space nation.
Wonderful. Brother Guy, if any of our listeners happens to go to Rome at some point and go to Vatican, is there a possibility to visit the observatory, or is that off limits?
What we do have is a visitor center that we are preparing in the papal gardens of Castel Gandolfo. It used to be where the popes spent their summers, but with Pope Francis, it's been turned into a museum. The gardens are beautiful. You can get a tour of the gardens today. Even with COVID, they're open now on the weekends, and once COVID goes away, they'll be open during the week. 2 of our telescope domes are in those gardens, and we've built a visitor center there. It's not open yet, but in the next couple of years, it will be. In the meantime, you can go to VaticanObservatory.org and do a virtual tour of not only our headquarters here in Rome, but also the telescope that we have in Arizona, the images we've made, the science we do, the fun we have speculating about all sorts of these things. We've got a little sort of community called Sacred Space Astronomy. to go along with sort of a pun on sacred space. And a number of writers, some of them religious, some of them not, but all of them fascinated by astronomy, who, their postings are visible for anybody to read. And if you want to join in the discussion, you can, be part of that community.
Great. We have a fun tradition in this podcast. The very last question is a little bit of a speculation in the form of inspiration. So this podcast is called Space Café Podcast. It's a coffee place. Of course, I'm not telling you anything new what coffee places are when you're familiar with Italy, with Rome. And in coffee places, now and then, you choose to have an espresso if you want to have a quick shot of taste and energy. Now, let's draw an analogy, an espresso for the mind. So what is it that you would like to share with us, with the audience, when it comes to inspiration, when it comes to science, astronomy, religion? Is there anything you would like to share that would sort of take the form of an espresso for the mind?
That blue sky overhead is not a barrier. It is not an impenetrable barrier. Space touches us with every meteor that you see, with every meteorite that hits the ground. And we touch space because we are living in outer space. The Earth is itself a part of this marvelous universe.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Brother Guy. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you all so much for being here today, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you'd like to learn more from Brother Guy, head over to our website at SpaceWatch.Global. Here we also have the link to the Vatican Observatory he was talking about. And as always, we look forward to your feedback. Let us know what you think of our panelists, or if you have any questions. Just send us a message either at podcast@spacewatch.global, or you can find us, of course, always on social media. Thanks for your interest. Looking forward to the next episode. Bye-bye.